We started off our discussion, Joe, talking about South Africa being a doorway to Africa. We know, of course, we've been invited to the next meeting of the BRIC countries by China. Do you see South Africa as a BRIC or Africa as a BRIC? Do we form parts of that formation in your view?
Yes, I think you do. I mean, what defines the BRICS? I mean, they are these countries very rapidly growing that are making the transition. Are these emerging markets, and each of them are different. I mean, obviously, India, China, Russia, and they're all very, very different. And South Africa would add an important dimension. It would be the only one on the African continent, and important, I think, for this grouping.
Despite the much smaller economy we have in South Africa.
A much smaller economy, but one of the characteristics that I think where there is a connection is that Brazil is doing a lot of interesting research and innovation. South Africa could be sort of the gateway for a lot of these ideas to come into the African continent. So I think it does make, in my mind, it makes a lot of sense for this grouping of countries to have one country, one member in Africa.
And do you think the new growth plan is that type of innovation that South Africa would need going forward as Brazil has?
Including the industrial policies, but also including sort of opening up the discussion of what you need to do, including a green economy. I mean, that's another important element in the growth strategy. Something that a number of the other countries really feel very intensely about. And so I think it could make an important contribution to this kinds of discussions they have at their meetings.
Alongside with the new growth plan, there's also been talk about nationalisation in South Africa of certain sectors, creation of perhaps state-owned mining companies, state-owned banks, with Postbank potentially filling that role. How do you view that in a developing economy like South Africa, and how would that be viewed by foreign investors wanting to invest in Africa and South Africa?
Well, I think that having certain state-run enterprises is not a problem. Anybody looking at, I've advocated, for instance, in the case of the United States, you looked at the way our banking system engaged in predatory lending against the poorest, and the recognition that it's really hard to regulate all the details. I mean, basically, if you have incentives to make money, and you have large populations that don't understand finance, and even large populations that do, with the credit card scandals in the United States. I mean, that is all the way to the 30% interest rates. Changing overdraft. They were making billions of dollars in overdraft fees without people knowing what were going on. They would reorder if you had 10 debits that were overdraft, and there's a fee per one, what they would do is they would pay the big one, so you would have the overdraft on the 9 others, so that you would maximize their. These are things that are really a problem.
Isn't it called capitalism?
Well, what I'm saying is there's a recognition that sometimes there's certain areas where there's a problem. I was very strongly critical of the fact when we privatized making the company that made enriched uranium, the same process that makes the key ingredient of atomic bombs. To me, that didn't make sense. Incentives to sell it to the highest bidder. I don't think we want the highest bidder to be getting nuclear material. So, those are areas where there's a role for the state. When there's a failure of the market, the state may have to come in temporarily. That every one of the advanced industrial countries basically turned to the government to bail them out, and kept the banking systems going. And if it weren't for the government, many of the countries, the whole economy would have collapsed. So I think the crisis, the 2008, 2009 crisis, has really given us a little bit of different perspective on maybe the magic of the private sector isn't quite the magic. There are important roles for the government, and you have to get the balance right. Now, in the area of mining, in my mind, the critical issue here is the value of the rents to these natural resources belong to the people of South Africa. You know, these are resources that are part of the endowment that you know, of the good fortune of being in South Africa. And these really belong to the people of South Africa. And then the question is, what is the best way of realizing the benefits of those natural resources? Now, you need investment, you need technology to realize that. And in some cases, where that resides is in the private sector. In the case of Brazil, their oil company, Petrobras, is a government-owned oil company, the best oil company in the world for deep water drilling, and much more responsible than BP, which caused a mess in the United States. So, you know, the contrast between Petrobras on the one hand and BP on the other leaves you to say, well, you know, maybe sometimes you want to have a government enterprise. Chile, the copper mines, some copper mines private, some national, government owned. At least some reports I've seen say, you know, they're comparable, efficient, but the government returns 10 times the amount of money to the public than the private one. But even the notion of what's private and public is getting obscure today. I don't know if you saw the recent article that BP, the largest shareholder in BP now is a Russian company in which the largest shareholder is the Kremlin. So now the largest shareholder of BP, a supposedly private company, is the Russian government. So the boundaries of these things have become much more ambiguous. I think one has to be, you know, pragmatic, but what is imperative is to make sure that you get the full value of the resources. I think most countries should be thinking about a resource tax. Australia has enacted one. I think other countries ought to be doing that. Israel has just taken another measure to make sure that they get fair value for their resources. This is becoming something that a number of countries, private sector-oriented economies, have done around the world.
Gina, we're almost out of time. I'll give you the last question.
I just had a quick question on monetary policy. I remember the last time you were here in South Africa, Professor, in 2009, you said that emerging markets shouldn't be too rigid in inflation targeting and look at things like financial stability and economic growth. Now, I think our Reserve Bank... And employment. Our Reserve Bank, under the leadership of Governor Jill Marcus, has certainly mentioned time and time again since her tenure began that employment is taken into account, financial stability is there, employment is there, and they've been a lot more transparent about it. Can you give us your account, or at least how foreigners view monetary policy in South Africa?
Well, I don't have the details of, you know, watched it that closely, but I think it's a move in the right direction very clearly. And you know, my criticisms were of the old style rigid inflation targeting, where you said that the main thing we worry about, or even in some countries, the only thing, the EU, it's the only thing they worry about is inflation. And interest rates are an important instrument, and they affect every aspect of our economy. Distribution of income, unemployment, and monetary policy ought to consider all of those. In the United States, the mandate of our central bank is to look at inflation, growth, and employment. It focused before the crisis too much on inflation. It thought that if it could keep inflation low and stable, it would solve everything. We know it was wrong. And we know that because they were focusing on inflation and thought, you know, they were very proud of how well they were doing, ignored the bubble, ignored the financial stresses, that focus, excessive focus on inflation, actually was an important contributor, I think, to the crisis.
So should we be cutting rates again in South Africa? We're having a meeting this week, ends up on Thursday. Do we need to cut rates further in South Africa?
I think there's room for growth in South Africa, and you know, there's going to be. This is actually an important question related to what you asked. There's going to be a risk of inflation from agricultural prices, food prices going up, and possibly energy, oil prices continue to be high. When you look at inflation, you have to ask, what is the source of inflation? And that's one of my criticism of inflation targeting. It doesn't distinguish what is the reason for inflation. If there's excess demand in the country, tight labor markets, then you have to dampen the economy, and that's a reason to raise interest rates. If it's coming from outside,
externally driven,
what I call imported inflation, then your view needs to be moderated. In other words, you still want to worry about it, but it's a very different response than the response when it's imported inflation. So, my concern is that if there is this kind of food inflation that some people are worrying about and energy inflation, don't let that drive your monetary policy to raise interest rates. Keep the focus on unemployment, your growth potential, and let that be an important part of the guide in setting interest rates.
So don't cut now, or rather don't cut now, just keep them as low as possible for as long as possible.
My view is low interest rates stimulate the economy, and so keep them low or lower if you can. And that will also help the exchange rate, which also helps competitiveness and helps growth and employment.
I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you very much for coming in this evening. It was great having you on the show.